Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Roseboro. I am a senior analyst at Heavy Reading, and my coverage area is the telco data center. So what I hope to do today is share with you some of the research that we've done specifically in the telco market, and just to, by way of definition, in this context, I'm using telco to mean telcos. It could be MSOs, it could be mobile operators, fixed operators. I use it just to really say, people who own a network as opposed to people like an AWS or a Microsoft that might be a pure play cloud provider. So just a real quick look at the agenda. I will tell you just who Heavy Reading is. Some of you may or may not be familiar with us. We'll have a little bit of discussion about what's happening from a technology standpoint within the telco vertical. Spent a decent amount of time talking about why open source is relevant to telco. Those of you who were in the keynotes this morning heard a very strong endorsement from AT&T, which is very exciting to see. I'll talk a little bit about what other telcos are saying about open source. We did a study just about, 3 or 4 months ago, surveying telcos globally about what they expect to get out of open source. Do they trust it? What are the benefits they hope to achieve? So we'll talk a little bit about that. A couple key takeaways, and then we should have plenty of time at the end to take your questions. So before I jump in, I'm just curious what the audience is comprised of. Are you guys developers? Are you end users? Who are developers here? Developers? Vendors? Well, one of the same, obviously. Okay, no telcos, operators? No? Oh, one. Okay, so you can keep me honest. Okay, good. I just like to know who I'm dealing with here. Okay, first, so Heavy Reading. Some of you may be familiar with Light Reading, which is the media side. They're kind of the outbound side, where it's an online media telecom community. Heavy Reading, we are the research side. So we're the deep, heavy thinkers. And so as you see, we write a lot of reports. We're focused exclusively on telco. We write a lot of reports, we do a lot of white papers, and we do an awful lot of surveys. We are able to leverage the Light Reading database of a few 100,000, 300,000 or 400,000 service providers globally. So that's a source of a lot of our information. And if anybody wants to know more about that, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But that's not what you're here for. So I want to talk about first off is, this is a time, and I'm sure, again, anybody who's been, paying attention lately, there's a lot going on in telco right now. And I would say it's actually unprecedented. I've been an industry analyst for 15 years, and I don't think I've ever seen so many things changing so dramatically at the same time. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things here. Obviously, SDN. I do not need to explain to anybody here why SDN is a big deal. But in the telco context, it's important not just in the data center, but also in the WAN. There's a lot happening in terms of extending the data center across the wide area network. Internet of Things, again, with connected cars and sensors. And even last night, it was quite interesting. I was on the judging panel for Dragon's Den, and the winning application actually was a software-defined cooling, which is something I had never thought about, which I thought was quite clever. And I would say there's certainly quite a bit of momentum building around IoT. NFV, again, you guys will be hearing a lot about that at this conference, and I'll be talking a little bit more about NFV later on during this presentation today. Cloud, again, don't need to go too much about why that's important. But within the telco context, it's important because that really is the end state for the virtualization. They'll virtualize the functions, but ideally what they like to do is have them reside in the cloud. And in fact, I was just talking to someone before I came in here about how SDN and NFV and cloud are all kind of converging, and people are starting to think about them together. White boxes. White boxes to me is actually quite fascinating. My first analyst position I had 15 years ago was covering switching and routing. And so the thought that now all that stuff is getting blown up and disaggregated it's again, very revolutionary. And again, you saw AT&T talking about that this morning. Having that kind of endorsement I think is quite important, because I never would have thought 15 years ago that we would have, a tier 1 operator like that talking about using, commodity hardware to run network functions. I think that's cool. And then last but not least is open source, which again, I don't need to tell you guys, why open source is important. But again, what I'd like to share with you today is a little bit about what the telcos themselves are thinking, excuse me, thinking about open source and what kind of benefits they hope to achieve from it. And again, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more deeply about the NFV and open source portions of these technology changes. So you'll see a lot of these slides that will say, we asked telcos. This is all, these are all things that were based on survey data that we got from a number of telcos. And as I mentioned, all this is, these are done globally. There are sometimes some regional differences, but really what usually determines the results of these kinds of surveys are the size of the operator and the kind of business they're in. As you can imagine, larger operators tend to be more likely to cloud, which means they are usually a bit further along in terms of virtualization and getting used to those tools. But anyway, so this is a survey that we did the end of last year, asking telcos how they felt about the pace of change. So I was saying it's unprecedented, and what's interesting here is that you see that 63% of the folks we surveyed actually think that this pace of innovation is going to accelerate over the next 5 years. Those of you who heard Kelly from Brocade speak this morning, he showed you that curve that with the open source, the momentum builds over time. So when I saw that, I thought, yeah, that's kind of in keeping with what we've been hearing. About a third think it's going to stay the same, but only a handful of people actually think innovation is going to slow down. I don't know that I've ever seen that happen, but the fact that it's 2/3 are saying it's going to get faster over the next 5 years, I think is actually pretty significant. And then we asked them what kind of technology areas they thought were going to have the biggest impact on the market over the next 5 years. And you see virtualization, which we left pretty broadly. It's not necessarily just NFV. It could be network virtualization, server virtualization, storage virtualization, all those things. Right very close behind next generation cloud services. So again, just we're always happy when we see similar results coming from different kinds of surveys. I know what I hear from people, and then we do these kinds of surveys, and we get further confirmation that this really is how they're thinking. Now, one of the big, I guess, questions, issues still to be determined is, I was mentioning that SDN, NFV, and cloud are happening at the same time. It's a question of how are they going to use that infrastructure, and right now, we asked folks, whether they had plans about how they were going to support NFV, or what the relationship, I should say, what the relationship is going to be between the data centers and NFV. And you see, only about a quarter of them have said they're actually already executing a strategy. And I'll say this was done just over a year ago. We're about to do this research again, and I fully expect those numbers to change a bit. So just keep that in mind when you see, only a quarter are executing. I think that number is going to be significantly higher when we do this in another couple months. I'm hoping that those 31% that said they were just starting to consider, that they were going to be in that, starting to execute. And the people, again, that have a strategy, they're going to start executing. And only 4% said they're not going to do it. Like I said, it's pretty well established among most of the telcos that NFV is what they're going to be doing. They might not necessarily know how they're going to do it, but it's pretty much on everybody's roadmap. So again, a year from now, I hope to be able to present this again and have much bigger pie slices for the people who are actually executing on that strategy. Yeah, go ahead. Why they want to do NFV? I can talk about it. I wasn't necessarily going to present it all here, but why are they doing NFV? It's not just for CapEx. I think that's part of it, but that's a small portion of it. It really is about OpEx. It's about being more agile. It's being more flexible. All those kinds of things. All the things they've gotten from the benefits of virtualization. They want to bring that to NF. They want to bring it to the network functions. I think I might have a slide that shows some of this, but anyway, yeah. not the price of the hardware. I won't say it's not a motivator, it's not the most significant one. I think when NFV first started, I think that was what people were talking about a lot. You can go from these really expensive proprietary boxes and run it on an x86 server. That's true, but CapEx is only about maybe 15% of their spend. Most of it is on OpEx. It's service creation, it's maintenance, it's integration, all those kinds of things. So it's more than just changing boxes. And like I said at the beginning, it's not even so much virtualizing, it's when you're able to get it into the cloud where you can have, you can pool the resources and automate those things, and that's when you really start to get the benefits of it. And I do have, trust me, I got tons of data, and I don't think I have it all in here, okay? This is, again, this one is actually pointing out that whole issue of, the intersection of cloud and NFV. And again, considering this was about a year ago, you see that it's pretty undecided. I mean, that's the key takeaway when you see something like that. We asked them, are you going to be running enterprise cloud and NFV workloads on the same infrastructure? More than a third of them said they haven't even decided yet. I don't know, again, I think that's going to change, but I don't know it's going to change dramatically when we run this again. You see that, I'm sorry, did someone, oh, okay. Sorry, a quarter of them said that they are going to be running enterprise cloud and NFV on common infrastructure. And then you've got 39% who said that they're going to have separate infrastructure. And that's actually something I would love to talk to folks about, because there's certainly some trade-offs depending on what kind of service you're talking about. If you're talking about a best effort service, you probably don't want to put that on the same platform with your highly regulated SLA, latency sensitive kind of application. So there's lots of, considerations in terms of how they're going to, which infrastructure you're going to run those functions on. But I will say, of that 25% that said they're already, the ones that said they want to use common infrastructure, that number goes to 50% for people who are already executing their NFV strategy. So again, I think this is one of those things where it's still so early, and again, this was just about a year ago, that people are still trying to figure out what the best strategy is to deploy this. So I think that's going to be interesting to watch over time. On the right-hand side, we asked the same question a slightly different way much more recently. I apologize. That source data is for the one on the left. The one on the right, that was actually based on a survey that we did about 2 months ago. So you see, what we're asking here is how important is it to be able to run your IT workloads and your VNFs, on the same hardware platform. And almost half of them say it's essential. So again, granted, it's not necessarily apples and apples, but it's kind of giving you a sense of how they're thinking. And I think you're even seeing just over the past year, seeing some kind of progression that, half of them say it's essential, 44% say it's important, not essential, but very important. And only 4% said it's not important at all. So, you were saying, is it a CapEx story, is it an OpEx story? This idea of being able to consolidate, again, it's not that everything runs on the same, but you can reduce the number, you can reduce the variability. You might have clusters of the same platforms that are configured differently, but again, if you can have fewer, bits that you have to, fewer, types of things that you have to manage, right there, you're going to get a benefit on the OpEx side. So, excuse me. So, whenever we do these surveys, we also try to get a sense for what is important to them when they're making their purchase decisions. Most of our clients are vendors, and so they kind of want to know what it is they need to be stressing. So, first thing, we're going to talk about what was important from a NFV solution standpoint. And you see that the number one thing is elasticity, which I will tell you I was very surprised when I saw that. Excuse me. Because what that actually reflects to me is that they're somewhat more sophisticated, perhaps, than I would have given them credit for. Elasticity, again, that's kind of the, once you get into the cloud, you can start having elastic resource pools and manage it differently. And so I think, all you vendors out there have been doing a great job of educating the market, because that came in. It was I wouldn't say double anything else, but it was pretty dramatically the most important thing. And Al Blackburn from AT&T actually mentioned that this morning. That I think some of you might have seen they had elasticity, agility, and something else even ahead of cost. Because again, if they can't become more agile, then the whole thing then it's not worth doing at all. So I thought that was quite interesting. Second is high performance. Again, anybody who works with telcos knows that's always a concern, especially when you're talking about services where they've got SLAs they need to meet. And there's still some question, perhaps not as strongly as it used to be, but there is still some concern that functions will be able to run as well on a standard server as opposed to a dedicated platform that might be performing just the one function. And then there's, again, some of you guys are probably involved in this. There are all sorts of technologies people are working on to bring parity to to get the performance at least close to what it was before, because there's some trade-offs in other dimensions. But I was, again, not surprised to see that. I actually thought that was going to be the number one concern, but it was number two. And three is security. And again, we'll see this when we talk about open source. They're always worried about security. So it's not necessarily an NFV issue. It's that telcos are always just paranoid about security. So, and probably rightfully so.
When you say high performance,
Yes.
what do they mean?
I think that's essentially throughput and primarily when I talk to people, it's usually about throughput, about being able to get things through as quickly on a generic server as you could on a dedicated platform. Performance obviously can also mean things like reliability and availability, but I think performance is really, can I get stuff through at the same quality level as I could before?
So they have specific requirements for the premises saying you got to meet these kind of requirements?
Yeah, they want to know that if they replace their dedicated firewall, and all of a sudden you're going to virtualize that, am I going to get the same throughput as I did before? And it doesn't always happen, especially when you put a hypervisor in the middle. That's added. There's going to be all sorts of latency going back and forth between the kernel. Anyway, they're concerned that it's not going to be consistent, and they're trying to. And I think there's probably some. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same. They're probably willing to give up some amount because of all the other benefits you get from the elasticity and all that. But they especially if it's for an SLA kind of service, they want to make sure they're not going to go backwards by virtualizing.
They want to minimize cost per user.
Oh, absolutely, especially for cloud. Right. And then we also asked them what they were looking for from their suppliers of NFV solutions. And interestingly enough, has a clear vision and roadmap for NFV came in number one. What I think this points to is the fact that the vendors and the telcos, everybody's learning together. And I think, yes, you have some of the folks like AT&T or Telefonica, I think NTT, very on the cutting edge, Orange. You guys have been doing this for a while, but a lot of people still need a lot of help. And so I think they're going to be depending very heavily on their vendors to help them, because this really is a big deal, clearly. Number two is systems integration capabilities. Very few greenfield left in the world. There's usually an environment that you're trying to bring in. You want to do this in the least disruptive way possible. I think that came up during one of the keynotes this morning, that they're just terrified of making any change because they don't want to break something. The operations guys just live to keep everything up and running, and they're going to be extremely careful about introducing anything into the network that could make it any less stable. And then the last, of course, is network understanding and experience. This is actually something, again, I'm going to be watching very carefully, and again, you guys might have some thoughts on this, about kind of who's driving the ship when it comes to NFV, because some people say SDN tends to be coming from the IT or the data center guys, NFV is coming from the network side, so maybe the network guys aren't perhaps as trusting as the IT guys because they don't think they really understand. So with this particular survey, it could just be that I got the network ops guys, but they want to make sure that the person that they're entrusting this virtualization project to really understands network stuff. Yep. Oh, it's pretty high. I only gave you the top 3. I've got a list of about 12. No, it was not in the top 3. No. Yeah. No, I don't think it's that it's not important. It's that performance. I think because they're so worried about meeting those SLAs, which So, Christos has asked me what did performance mean? You could also include some of those things. How is the service, does the service do what it used to do? And it could also be from a reliability and availability standpoint. And also, we said NFV solutions because, in fact, the ISG has actually said it's not even so much anymore about hardware availability, it's about service availability, which is not exactly what we're asking here. So again, not that I'm saying that they don't still think 5 nines is important from a hardware standpoint, because I think that's a cultural change that's going to take some time. But I think it's just these other things were just higher ranked. Like, so if you want, I could later give you where that ranked, because I know it was on the list. It just didn't make the top 3. Okay. So, as you well know, there are no shortage of open source projects for telcos. Of course, Open Daylight, I had to put that one in first. We got OpenStack, again, not telling you guys things you don't know. Obviously, that with NFV, we're introducing a very new way of creating and deploying services. So orchestration is obviously a very key concern. OPNFV. Okay. which for me I think is going to be critical, very, very critical in terms of getting all this stuff to work together, because as you know, there are lots of different constituencies in each of these, within Open Daylight and OpenStack and all the rest, and having somebody having a group of people that are committed to making sure all this stuff works to meet the specific needs of telcos, I think is really, really very important. Open Compute. This one has not been is not as top of mind just yet for the telcos. I think we're seeing it in pockets. This whole disaggregation model is, again, it's very new, a little bit scary. And as we'll see later, there's some concerns about skill set. Do they have, do they have the ability to, pick and choose and aggregate and integrate and test and do all those things themselves? But they do like the idea of being able to have different options and be able to pick and choose and have more flexibility. And we'll see that when we talk about open source, that really is a big driver behind why they want to do that. KVM, again, with NFV, you have the hypervisor layer, and they like the idea of using an open one, an open flow. So anyway, so there's lots of open source projects that the telcos are interested in, involved with, engaged in, and I think really understand the benefits. And we're going to talk about that in about 2 slides. So that one I definitely have, why do they care about open source? But I will start with my smiley face slide, which I thought was funny until I was at Dragon's Den last night, and I think 2 out of the 6 people had smiley faces. So maybe it's an Open Daylight thing. I don't know. But this actually is kind of how they feel. Over here you see, they really like the idea of the rapid innovation. Presumably you get higher quality with more people looking at it and finding bugs early, and everybody gets to benefit from. Someone finds it here, everybody can benefit from it, and so they understand. That presumably, not guaranteed, of course, but presumably that quality can be improved. Interoperability is huge, which again we'll see in a couple of slides. And lower license costs. Notice I didn't say costs, which we'll see in a second. But from a licensing standpoint, yes, presumably if they want to, they could go and download the community version. In the middle, integration, again, that's still a concern. Support. And by support, I'm talking about the vendor support they usually get in terms of bug fixes and maintenance and upgrades and things like that. Telcos historically are very reliant on their vendors for a lot. I mean, historically they were sometimes the same company, obviously, but they are very accustomed to relying on their vendors to support them with those kinds of services. Stability, and here I'm talking about the stability of the code. Again, as much as they say there can be higher quality, when they see that anybody can be part of it, there could be some concerns that this stuff is not necessarily stable and locked down. And then security, like I said, security is always an issue. But then on the far side, you see that what gives them a little bit of pause, you might say, is that working with open source, that's a whole new set of skills. It's a whole new model for buying equipment, deploying services. A lot of stuff is changing. There's new vendors that they're having to deal with. Again, some of them are pretty comfortable working with the same people they've always worked with, and open source brings in a whole new group of people. and processes. Again, I think it was Al's presentation this morning that showed at the very bottom, the foundation of all this change is the people, process, and culture. And with open source, presumably if you do it, I wouldn't say correctly, but in a likely way, it's going to be very disruptive. And so all that stuff, change is scary. So I was able to come up with 4 for each category, and that probably is pretty representative because depending on which area you're talking about, they can either be yay open source or a little bit concerned about it. So you had asked me about, why are they doing these changes? So you see, what are the main benefits of using open source solutions? No vendor lock-in, sorry guys, but that comes up a lot. Now, that's not to say that it's not possible to get lock-in in an open source model. If you're going to, get a vendor-supported distribution, you may find yourself, trading one kind of lock-in for another, but that's a whole other set of issues. But you see I think the number is about 89%, it was no vendor lock-in. Lower software license costs, again, we talked about on the previous slide. Again, they have the option of lower license costs. Again, that's not a guarantee, because again, if you get a vendor-supported distribution with all the other bells and whistles that come with it, it could be lower, but not perhaps dramatically. Enabling a multi-vendor environment. Again, this kind of relates to the first one about avoiding vendor lock-in. And it's really not even so much about lock-in, it's about having flexibility and choice. They want to be able to pick whoever's solution they want and have it work with everybody else's without a whole lot of headache. That's really what that's getting to. Faster service creation. Again, that was about a little more than half where we're talking about faster service creation. And I think what that is speaking to is not so much open source, but the fact that open source will be part of a larger transformation in terms of moving to a cloud model. So I think that's probably what we're picking up there, perhaps not so much just open source. Easier integration, again, I keep harping on this. I actually thought that was going to be I thought that benefit was going to rank much higher than it did, because this is part of a much larger study. Integration came up a lot, and I think it could just be in relation to the other things it wasn't as high, and I think also the way you asked the question, because you'll see in another slide, integration's a big deal, and lower maintenance costs. You see, they don't really expect it to be a significantly different model, and what that suggests to me is that, yes, there are going to be a handful of operators that actually will go to the website and download the code and compile it and do all that themselves. But I think most of them are not. I think most of them are going to want to go to a vendor who can test it and certify it and integrate it and support it and all that kind of stuff. That's more what I expect to have happen. Oops. There we go. So we also asked them what was their level of concern about these various aspects. And surprise, surprise, their security. Again, like I said, it's not so much that they're worried about the security of open source, they're worried about security because it's security. Sorry, I keep covering this up. Software stability, that came in, almost as high. And there's interoperability. See that, here it ranks much higher. That's just something they are concerned about. So they're concerned about it, and the previous slide made it seem that they're not particularly confident that open source is going to get them that interoperability. So again, taken together, it presents kind of a mixed picture. Vendor support, I kind of talked about that already. Integration, again, this points back to wanting to minimize disruption. Cost of switching to open source solutions, again, not particularly high, about 40% or so. And competitive differentiation came in extremely low, which actually somewhat surprised me. I thought it would be more so because a lot of what you hear is that, okay, well, Google and Microsoft are doing this, and so I'm going to have to be like them. But that's really only an issue for the larger operators who have cloud businesses. When we go outside of North America and Western Europe, this comes in extremely low, actually. Because there was some concern that we're going to have to adopt open source because our competitors are, and we want to be able to be as agile. We want to have the same cost base as them. But so far, at least, it's not showing up to be a huge driver. Oh, yep. I think whenever they say the word security, they just freak out. I think there is, in having, in this, it didn't come out from this, the quantitative side, but when I spoke with, I keep doing that, sorry. When I spoke with them, there is some sense that because anybody can get into the code, presumably that gives someone an opportunity to do something that they shouldn't. By the same token, you have so many people looking at it, you'd like to think someone would notice something. Granted, things do happen. But I think that's what it is. I think the open nature, because there is no restriction on who can at least submit something. Obviously, it doesn't get committed automatically, but I think that's really what it is, as opposed to a process that is controlled by a vendor who presumably has much more control over that. That's where I think that comes from. Oh, examples of an open source security. Well, I mean, there was obviously the, within open source projects, there have been security, issues, but I can't think of any operator who had deployed open source and then had some kind of got hacked or something like that. I can't think of anything that's unique to open source. I can't. I mean, does anybody in the audience? I can't think of anything like that. I think it's more of a, we can see this could be a problem, but like I said, they're always concerned about security, always. So, I'm curious to know what you guys think. We asked them, why aren't you deploying open source, or what do you think the main obstacles are? And I'm curious what you guys would think would be. I got 5. I'm just curious whether you guys will get the ones that they said. Why do you think telcos are not deploying open source yet? Yep.
I think that we did React applications included to be telco ready.
Okay. Meaning, the applications that are running on open source solution. Okay. Yeah. Yep. I think that one's actually no, that's not in the top 5. Nope. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Not concerns about open source, but these are the barriers to actually deploying it. So it's slightly different. Here, I'll give you one to start with. One of them is just cost. It just costs. I'm not ready to do it yet because it's going to cost too much. I'll give you a couple of them, and I'll see if there's any others. Number 4 was unclear ROI, which I think is actually quite interesting because he kept saying that it's going to be lower software costs, potentially lower maintenance costs, but it's not necessarily clear that even if I do lower that, then I'm going to be able to get an upside on the revenue side. So it's interesting. Yeah. Reliability. Yeah, I think reliability is covered with stability. Stability, reliability, availability. I think someone talked about earlier, all the ilities, but I think they're all kind of tied in. They're all tied into each other. And I think again, it's not necessarily just the initial cost of procuring it. I think it's the process of integrating it in, and integrating it and testing it and all those kinds of things. Yeah,
But I mean, that's not really only pertinent to open source.
No.
It's pertinent to any type of
Right. But I think it's a matter of, those last 2 are saying, I need to convince somebody that it's worthwhile making a change to how we've been doing things. And CFOs, as you know, I mean, they kind of are, holding those purse strings pretty tightly. 3 is inertia, which I thought was an awesome answer. I think one of the sponsors who worked on this with us, they threw inertia in there. And it's hard to fight inertia. Again, you've got to have really compelling reasons to get people to change the way they do things, right? The cost of running 2 networks. Again, this is a bigger deal obviously for the larger operators, but again, and I'm sure this is what you've seen, they're not going to just wholesale all of a sudden, they're not ripping out anything, first of all. It's going to be, here's a new service, let's try it here, let's do a POC, and you slowly kind of bring that in. But, as that one gets larger, you still have to keep, you still got to pay the bills. So you got to keep that other stuff going. The number 1 thing is lack of skill set. Now, I think, again, I've heard AT&T speak a few times. I think he mentioned that this morning, that AT&T is investing quite a bit in retraining their folks. And people ask me all the time, how soon will this transformation take place? I say, it's going to take a long time to get some new DNA into these. I mean, you've seen companies like CenturyLink have acquired some new DNA, by bringing in a cloud company and kind of letting them lead the way. But I think it's going to take a while because again, it's just a very different way of doing business. So, and again, it was pretty strongly. I didn't do a bar chart because I wanted to give you some different kind of ways of looking at this. But that one was pretty significant, the lack of skill set. So similarly, we asked about criteria for when they're selecting open source solutions, and I'll just go right to the chase on this one, so I want to make sure we got a little bit of time for questions. You see, again, number one is integrating with their existing data center infrastructure. So I said, if nothing else, these guys are consistent. I said, these are different studies asking the same question about a different domain. Integration comes up a lot. Support for cloud management and orchestration. As I mentioned, for everybody, that's a big deal, but if you're a service provider whose business is to, offer services to customers who are paying you, you want to make sure that stuff all works. And then modularity. I think when we run this again next year, I think that'll probably end up being, I don't know if it'll move up to number 2, but I think the gap will be lower because I think you're hearing more and more people starting to understand that there is some benefit to having this disaggregated model. So if you need to scale up memory, but you don't need to scale up compute, you can do those kinds of things. I think they're just now starting to understand that modularity could be good. And this was pretty. That was the only word we put down. We didn't say modular software or modular hardware. So again, we can be a little bit more descriptive next time around. But it was still pretty low. And then in terms of what they want out of their open source solution suppliers, support, number 1. Like I said, even more so than NFV, I think this is a bigger deal for open source because I think, again, it's even more of a departure for how they've been doing business. They want someone who's had a lot of experience with open source, rightfully so. And then here's our integration again. So last thing, just a couple key takeaways. I hope it's quite clear to you that it's transforming. It's happening now. Like I said, lots of moving parts, innovation coming from all over the place. Change is a must. They're going to have to do some things differently than they have in the past. And I think, again, for the most part, I think they know change is coming. They know they know where they want to be, sort of, but how to get there, still uncertain. And I am very convinced that open source will play a role. I think. You saw the numbers. In a chart that I didn't include, we asked what they were going to use open source for. Was it for OpEx savings? Was it for greater agility? Only 3% of folks said they weren't going to use open source at all. So to me, that's it's not going to be widespread initially. It's going to take some time to ramp up. But I think they've kind of gotten religion on it. And again, this is not just to make happy with you guys, but I do think there is a tremendous opportunity for the vendor community to help the telcos become more comfortable with it, to engage with it more, and explain to them, not just explain to them, demonstrate to them the benefits they can achieve. So I got about 8 minutes left according to this. Anybody have any other questions for me? Yep. I'm sorry? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So can you have any definition or some example of what skill set, for example, that means and whether they can be programmed? Do they? It's more a function of do they have people on staff who know how to use Python scripting, or Chef, or Puppet? Yeah, well, actually, skill set can actually encompass a lot of different things. It's not just, do you know these other programming languages? It's, do you know how to, how do you engage with an open source community? How does that process work? How do you, integration's huge. Again, because. And also, how do you configure a service in this new environment? How do you use an orchestrator? I'm used to going to a CLI and typing in commands, and now I go to this GUI thing and I click, click, click. So it's not just, I think when you first hear it, you think, I don't know how to use the code. Like, I don't know how to code, or I don't understand the language. But it's actually much larger than that. I know Christos was kind of, I don't know, did you want to say anything about that? You were kind of mumbling something there. No, it's,
The integration, I mean, it's a totally different thing for us.
yeah,
Software engineers is one thing.
yeah. Right, how do you test it? How do you qualify it? How do you upgrade it? It's, like I said, it's, and again, and engaging with open source, I think it's just a different mentality. If you show up at the same place as your competitors, that's a completely different mind. I'm not saying that's a skill. I think that's more of a cultural thing, but it's all that stuff is changing at once. It really is quite dramatic.
Mentality is the key word, how you
Right.
collaborate with others and everything.
I mean, based on your description, I do see a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
Does this really use CapEx, OpEx, what cost? Based on
Just open source itself. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that. Yeah, I mean, say, yeah, what cost? Well, you don't have to pay licensing costs to a hardware vendor anymore. You could, if you wanted to, go to GitHub or wherever you guys store all your stuff, download it, compile it yourself, and load it onto a server and start running services on it. And you don't have to pay any cost. You don't have to pay anything to a vendor. Theoretically, you could. Telecom becomes a vendor. Telecom could do it for them. Basically, they could do it for themselves instead of paying somebody else to do that. They could. My gut tells me they're still going to be reliant. Again, they're still going to want to deploy these solutions. They can still be open source, but I think most are going to want to get a Red Hat or an HPE or a Brocade. They're going to want to get somebody to test it and certify it and integrate it for them. That's where the skill set comes in. They're not going to know that code well enough to even know how you'd even start that process of making it all work together. Make sense? Anything else? Oh, yep.
So you talked about open source packages, incorporating entire telco based on open source. Is it really necessary for everything to be open source, or are there
No.
certain pieces that are the key focus areas?
Does everything need to be? Nothing has to be. No, I mean, they're looking at it in conjunction with all these other things they're doing. If they're doing they're going to be deploying new technology for NFV. You have a choice. Do I want to continue to buy hardware from the people I've always bought it from, or do I want to go to a model where I can pick my OS and I can pick my hardware and do that myself? Presumably, again, presumably lower acquisition costs. It's more of a which way where do you want to have your growth coming from? Do you want to have it on the old platforms? Do you want to have it on the new platforms? That's really what this comes down to. So it's not that this is, if they weren't undergoing these other transformations in terms of SDN and virtualization and things, if that wasn't happening, the momentum behind open source wouldn't be what it is in the telcos. It's just more that they're in the process of making these changes anyway. So now that I have an option, let me at least consider that. I think that's really where it's coming from. Yep.
Are they saying to their OEMs, you can now only supply hardware or software, make a choice, or that you need to repackage your solution as a software-only solution?
I don't think they're requiring it. I think they are, well, again, I keep harping on AT&T just because they've been so visible about this, but in the Domain 2.0 spec, they said this is how we want to buy in the future. We want to be able to have the option to do it this way. That's, again, but I mean, if you look at anybody's, people are still buying the other stuff, don't get me wrong. But it's more that they want to have the choice. And I think that's what a lot of this comes down to, is they want to be the ones to decide what software they use and how quickly they get new services and all that kind of stuff.
So countering that, then, are the OEMs migrating to being reliant ISVs instead of software?
Some of them are. If you look at someone like Brocade,
Yes.
they are. Yes, they still have a hardware business, but they are, but they are still investing a great deal, through acquisition and things to build up software. I think if you look at pretty much all of them, and I used to know these numbers, but the amount of engineers they have working on hardware versus on software, that line crossed a long time ago. The value really is getting more into the software, and it has been for a while. So do I think they're not going to get out of the hardware business? But when you think about, like Ericsson made the announcement, 6 months ago with HTS 8000. They're working with Intel to get use their rack-based architecture, I think it is. So what Ericsson's bringing to the party is the software, and they're using this.
So the suppliers will be the same suppliers, just repackaging.
That's what a lot of it is, yeah. So the differentiating IP is the software. To how do you make that software, optimize that software for that different hardware? Yeah, I don't think. Again, there are still people who are going to be making custom ASICs to perform certain functions. We're talking about performance. There are still some functions that you're still going to require that. So I'm not trying to suggest that everything's going to be open source and virtualized and all that stuff for a number of different reasons. But I think that's the preferred method for things as much as they can. Yep. Oh.
How much does the risk of open source license compliance management weigh into our decisions or their barrier to
I think it's something that people who are engaged with it a lot know that that's an issue. I have had that come up in some discussions, going through the legal, going with their legal teams to say, here's what I'm trying to do because, and the license allows me to use it in this particular way, but they are very careful. I don't think that they're not as sensitive to it as they should be, and I think that's going to happen more. But I don't know that I'm not going to use it because this could be an issue, but just being aware that there are going to be some limitations or things they have to do in terms of contributing back if they use that distribution, something like that. Yep.
Telcos, we've got a lot of data on telcos, but
Yep.
they're made up of different businesses like on-demand, cloud, wireless, wireline.
Yep.
Is there any, even on that, which area they're focusing on open source, where they're most likely to want to change?
I do. I would say, not here, but I would say that the people who seem to be moving the fastest are the ones who have cloud businesses, which are the wireline guys. But a lot of the NFV, if you were to, and I'm sure you've seen this from other analyst firms, virtual CPE, virtual EPC, and things like virtual firewall and load balancing, those are the things. So those are not necessarily a wireline versus wireless thing, but it's more the functions themselves, because a lot of that layer 4 to 7 stuff has already been virtualized, so they're just taking it, putting it on a different platform. Cloud I'd say cloud's probably the single biggest contributor to the pace at which people are making these changes. That seems to be the strongest impetus for change. Okay, thanks guys. Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Roseboro. I am a senior analyst at Heavy Reading, and my coverage area is the Telco data center. So what I hope to do today is share with you some of the research that we've done specifically in the telco market, and just to, by way of definition, in this context, I'm using telco to mean telcos. It could be MSOs. It could be mobile operators, fixed operators. I use it just to really say, people who own a network as opposed to people like an AWS or a Microsoft that might be a pure play cloud provider. So just a real quick look at the agenda. I will tell you just who Heavy Reading is. Some of you may or may not be familiar with us. We'll have a little bit of discussion about what's happening from a technology standpoint within the telco vertical. Spent a decent amount of time talking about why open source is relevant to telco. Those of you who were in the keynotes this morning heard a very strong endorsement from AT&T, which is very exciting to see. I'll talk a little bit about and it was quite interesting. I was on the judging panel for Dragon's Den, and the winning application actually was a software-defined cooling, which is something I had never thought about. Which I thought was quite clever. And I would say there's certainly quite a bit of momentum building around IoT. NFV, again, you guys will be hearing a lot about that at this conference, and I'll be talking a little bit more about NFV later on during this presentation today. cloud, again, don't need to go too much about why that's important. But within the telco context, it's important because that really is the end state for the virtualization. They'll virtualize the functions, but ideally what they like to do is have them reside in the cloud. And in fact, I was just talking to someone before I came in here about how SDN and NFV and cloud are all kind of converging, and people are starting to think about them together. White boxes. White boxes to me is actually quite fascinating. My first analyst position I had 15 years ago was covering switching and routing. And so the thought that now all that stuff is getting blown up and so as you see, we write a lot of reports. We're focused exclusively on telco. We write a lot of reports, we do a lot of white papers, and we do an awful lot of surveys. We are able to leverage the light reading database of a few 100,000, 300,000 or 400,000 service providers globally. So that's a source of a lot of our information. And if anybody wants to know more about that, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But that's not what you're here for. So I want to talk about first off is, this is a time, and I'm sure, again, anybody who's been, paying attention lately, there's a lot going on in telco right now. And I would say it's actually unprecedented. I've been an industry analyst for 15 years, and I don't think I've ever seen so many things changing so dramatically at the same time. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things here. Obviously, SDN. I do not need to explain to anybody here why SDN is a big deal. But in the telco context, it's important not just in the data center, but also in the WAN. There's a lot happening in terms of extending the data center across the wide area network. Internet of Things, again, with connected cars and sensors, and even less other telcos are saying about open source. We did a study just about, 3 or 4 months ago, surveying telcos globally about what they expect to get out of open source. Do they trust it? What are the benefits they hope to achieve? So we'll talk a little bit about that. A couple key takeaways, and then we should have plenty of time at the end to take your questions. So before I jump in, I'm just curious what the audience is comprised of. Are you guys developers, are you end users? Who are developers here? Developers, vendors? Well, one of the same, obviously. Okay, no telcos, operators? No? Oh, one. Okay, so you can keep me honest. Okay, good. I just like to know who I'm dealing with here. Okay, first, so heavy reading. Some of you may be familiar with light reading, which is the media side. They're kind of the outbound side, where it's an online media telecom community. Heavy reading, we are the research side. So we're the deep, heavy thinkers. And aggregated it's again, very revolutionary. And again, you saw AT&T talking about that this morning. Having that kind of endorsement, I think, is quite important, because I never would have thought 15 years ago that we would have, a tier 1 operator like that talking about using, commodity hardware to run network functions. I think that's cool. And then last but not least is open source, which again, I don't need to tell you guys, why open source is important. But again, what I'd like to share with you today is a little bit about what the telcos themselves are thinking, excuse me, thinking about open source and what kind of benefits they hope to achieve from it. And again, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more deeply about the NFV and open source portions of these technology changes. So you'll see a lot of these slides that will say, we asked telcos. These are all things that were based on survey data that we got from a number of telcos. And as I mentioned, all this is, these are done globally. There are sometimes some regional differences, but really what usually determines the results of these kinds of surveys are the size of the operator and the kind of business they're in.